Thank you and good morning. I'm going to be delivering my presentation in American English. So maybe we should have a translator up here. During some of the phone calls in preparation for this, I had to politely ask the people on the other end to say what they said slowly for an American ear. And they were very gracious to do it. And also, Claire, I really think it's very brave to get up and begin by telling us that your brother hates your voice. That was a very brave thing to do. And also to do the intervention so that you could see people. So I always appreciate spontaneous gestures like this. So happy to be back in Australia and first time in Adelaide. Very excited to be here. Australia and Italy are the favorite countries in the world for my wife and I to visit. And Italians never ask why, but some Australians do. Maybe that's why I identify with Australians, because I'm from Minnesota in the US, where we don't brag about ourselves very much. And so in Australia, when we were in Perth and we just decided to be there for a week, and people would say, "Are you passing through?" No, actually, we're just in Perth. Well, where else are you going? No, just in Perth. And they would say, "Why?" And I realized that's exactly what a Minnesotan would do. If you decided you were going to spend a week just in Minnesota, they would say, "Why are you doing this?" So I think I identify with that humility of Australians. So what I want to do, this is the setup. This is the sort of presentation setup for the conversation I want to have with you after tea. The other thing I've learned is how important those tea breaks are here. So you will not miss a single second of that, because I know if I go past 10:30, the edginess will start in the room. So I do know that. So this is the presentation part, and then I'll be engaging you in conversation after the tea. So my title is Social Networks as Marriage and Relationship Educators. And my premise is that we don't pay enough attention to the informal education that's going on, the powerful social influences that are going on outside of what we're doing. So we have curricula, we have services we provide, and we inevitably have, and I put myself in this category, inevitably have the professional mindset, the professional bias, if you will, that the action with regards prevention, with regards change and improvement in relationships, the action is occurring on our watch. It's occurring in our settings, in our offices, in our programs, because that's where we are. It's kind of like a doctor thinking that healthcare mostly is going on in the clinic or the hospital. And what we know in healthcare, caring for health, where does most of it occur? It occurs in families, it occurs in neighborhoods, it occurs in communities. So using that analogy for a minute, there's 7 illness episodes treated at home for every one that's seen by a physician. This is the research in the US. Does that make sense? And then when people go to a doctor, they are referred by their family and friends. They consult about their medical problems. I would never dream of going to the doctor without having first run my symptoms by my wife. She would be sort of stunned. It would actually have to have been an emergency that I didn't talk to her about my symptoms, right? You know what I'm talking about? And so what we know in healthcare is that these changes occur in norms about healthcare, and they're powerful changes in norms. They are partially influenced by what doctors and medical scientists do, but they occur far more at the level of community. So my theme here today is really my goal is to get us outside of our focus on what we do in our programs, what we do in our service delivery, and really what's going on out there and how perhaps we could intentionally influence those social relationships and norms. So you with me on that? So none of this is going to be about our curricula. None of this is going to be about the evidence we have for what we do. It's going to be about the potential to tap into broader social networks. We are a small current in a sea, an ocean of influences on relationships. Does everybody agree with that premise? Okay. So what I'm saying, most of us intuitively know, and in recent years, we have some science behind it. So there's something called social network analysis, social network theory, social network research, which it looks at the influences in existing social networks, has for years identified that some people are nodes in social networks. Some people are strong influencers. So when people study high school students, and in fact the marketers are onto this, they want to introduce a new piece of electronic gear. What some of the marketers do, instead of paying for magazine articles or Facebook ads, they hire unemployed anthropology graduates, and they go into schools and they ask, who's the coolest kid you know? And they keep asking, who's the coolest kid they know? And they gradually start to figure that out until they get to the boy or girl who says, me. And everybody else agrees, okay? And those are the kids who are strong social influencers. So they give them one of these contraptions for free, and everybody else wants to start using it, okay? So that research has been around, but not a lot of really high-quality research in healthcare. It's starting about 7 years ago. A group of researchers at Harvard and Stanford, Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler in particular, began to mine a very rich data set out of a place called Framingham, Massachusetts. The famous Framingham study, which began in the 70s, went on for like 25 years, followed thousands of people, average people in this community, gave them health assessments every year, and produced the groundbreaking research that informs modern healthcare, particularly around hypertension and heart disease. That's where they really found out, very definitively showed the influence of hypertension on stroke and heart disease, and how if you intervene, you can really lower the incidence of strokes and heart disease. So what Christakis and Fowler realized is that this was a big social network followed for over 20 years. Wherever people went around the US or the world, they were followed, okay? And that every year they were asked a question, who are your friends and family members who will know where you are next year? And the reason they were doing this was not for social network research purposes, but in order to track people. And what Christakis and Fowler realized is that there was a gold mine of data, because you had all of these people saying who their friends were and who the key family members were. And so we could tell that I listed you as a friend, did you list me as a friend? Okay? And then when you moved, you listed other people. You moved to, in the States, you moved to California, and then you had other people out there who knew you, okay? So you get this idea of this sort of, this net, this sort of beehive. What they did was they got funding to go into these index cards and put it on a big data set. And they produced some remarkable research using very sophisticated statistical tools published in like the New England Journal of Medicine and other very high status journals. And what they found was that in their first study, that cigarette smoking cessation occurred through reverberations through social networks through 3 degrees of separation. So here's how it looks. So you'll be my 3 degrees here, okay? So make sure you make eye contact with me here, because otherwise I'll drift off, okay? You don't have to do anything, but just look at me, okay? So you and I are friends. It makes intuitive sense that if we both smoke and you quit, then I'm more likely to quit, okay? Right? We know that. The second degree of separation is with you. You're yawning now. I'm sorry, I'm losing you here. Anyway, I was getting to you. I was getting to you, okay? She just yawned because I was paying attention to her friend. This is how it goes. So you two are friends, and I don't know you. I don't know you, I know you. If your friend quits smoking, I am more likely to quit smoking, even if you don't. That's 2 degrees of separation. And then it goes out a 3rd degree of separation. Now, at each point, the influence is less, but it's still statistically significant. So 3 degrees out, if I don't know, you may be living in a different part of the country. So it's not like we're in the same neighborhood. You may be living in a different part of the country, and if you quit smoking, I am more likely to quit smoking over the next couple of years. Yeah, you're looking at me like, what? It sounds like voodoo. The theory behind it is it's a renorming that is occurring. The social norms are shifting, okay? So if you quit and then other people in your social network who also smoke may be thinking, I should really quit. So that the next time I'm with you, you're still smoking, and I say I should get rid of these things, they're killing me, you're more apt, the theory is, to say, yeah, maybe you should, because in your social world, the norm is shifting, okay? The next study was with the increase in obesity, in weight gain, which you could see we've done together as tribes, and it's through 3 degrees of separation. That, in other words, the notion of what is sort of normal weight has shifted over time through these tribes we're part of. Again, through 3 degrees of separation. So you getting this idea? And then that's just on average, but you have some people who are nodes who have a lot of social connections. When those people make a shift, a lot more other people shift. Whereas, and in fact, with Framingham, they mapped, you can see on their journal articles, they've mapped the social network, and you see some people are outliers. They're sort of isolates, you know, they have a few connections, and other people are densely connected, densely connected. So when I read these studies, as somebody interested in marriage and relationships, I wrote to Nicholas Christakis and I said, has anybody done this with divorce? Because I'd love, if nobody has, I'd love to get some funding and do that. And he said, yes, in fact, they have. And so their group has published a study looking at the spread of divorce as a social contagion, because that's the informal language they use to describe this research, is social contagion. So cigarette smoking, obesity, social contagion, now divorce. And what they found in their study of divorce is that it spreads with 2 degrees of separation. Okay, not 3, but 2 degrees of separation. So the friend of my friend, or the sister of my friend getting divorced makes me more likely to get divorced. And we have, of course, intuitively known this. I mean, I'm a product, I was in graduate school in the 1970s, and in the States, that was 68 to 80 was the tremendous increase in the divorce rate. And there were groups like everybody got divorced. I mean, there were cohorts of graduate students where everybody got divorced. And so what I'm saying is something we sort of intuitively have known, but now we have some numbers on it with some very sophisticated statistical tools. And so here is what Christakis and Fowler say in their article about divorce as social contagion. And this is the quote: from a policy perspective, divorce should be understood as a collective phenomenon that extends far beyond those directly affected. And they say the results of their studies suggest that, so listen to this now, attending to the health of one's friends' marriages serves to support and enhance the durability of one's own relationship. We are in this together. So no relationship, no marriage is an island. and the way in which the rise or fall of other people's relationships affects mine. And this is a way to think about how it isn't just the marriages, relationships of people with minor children, because there's been so much emphasis on the effect of divorce and breakup on families with minor children. Certainly now at this stage in my life, my wife and I have been married for 43 years, and we've grown up kids and grandkids. The dissolution of a long-standing marriage, a long-standing union, has tremendous effects on the environment. And I think of it as like a massive oak tree in the town square when that goes down. So in the US, when former Vice President Al Gore and presidential candidate Al Gore and his wife Tipper broke up, whoa, they were really seen as a pair that sent seismic waves through the US. Now, their kids were long grown, but I don't know if any of you know the story, but both of their daughters got divorced within a year before or after. The whole family ended up with folks divorced. And so you have a renorming that occurs and these sort of powerful interactions. So before I go on to say the implications of this, I want to see is anybody confused or have questions or clarification about what I'm saying we're learning about the power of social networks to create norms that change people's behavior, that influence people's behavior. So any clarifications or questions? Because everything else I'm going to say is based on your buying that and understanding that it's these degrees of separation out there, the strangers of strangers, that is powerful. Yes?
It's not age-related at all, is it?
No, they didn't find powerful, important age-related with the divorce study. No, and in general, they are not finding that. Yeah. So, any other clarification questions? Okay. So, what I want to do is to challenge us to take into account, if we want to make a difference at the population level, and not just with the people who come in our door, I want to challenge us to think about the possibility that we could try to intentionally influence social norms. Another aspect of this work is of thinking, if you think about, say, 3 degrees of separation for many health behaviors, it was 2 around divorce, but most of the research finds 3 degrees of separation. The research on social networks indicates a pretty wide range of how many people in an individual or are in somebody's close social network of reciprocal relationships. But one fair number would be 20, that an average person may have 20 people in pretty close reciprocal relations. That would be family and friends. Some may have 80 or 100, some may have 5, but let's just say 20. And so if you want to think about people's influences through 3 degrees of separation, then an individual's behavior can influence 8,000 people. Individual's behavior can influence 8,000 people, okay? If you want to just think about divorce, take 1 degree off that and you have 4,000, okay? So the people who come to our programs, the people that we counsel, are massive influencers of their social environment. So that's an example of a thought to plant. If we know that, if we understand that, how might we take that into account in our work? So that's an example of the sort of question that I'm asking you to think about, that we can talk about after the break. If we think of the people that come to us as not just individuals or couples who come to consume what we offer and then go home as individuals, but if we think of them as players, as influencers in a beehive of social relationships, how might that how might that influence our work? You get that question? How might that influence? Because frankly, until the last 10 years or so, I never thought that way. I never thought that way. I thought about it as, how many people can we get to come and receive these services, and how do we expand those services? Of course, the problem with that is there's never going to be enough services. Even prevention services, there's never going to be enough. There's never going to be enough. Okay, so let me give some examples to stimulate your thinking about social change. What I've learned in Australia is that you have now have very strict drunk driving laws, and even stricter than the U.S. Do you have a term here in Australia we have in the U.S. called a designated driver? Okay. So there's an interesting story about how that became widely known and used in the United States. And I heard this from one of the people involved in the project. There was a group of public health experts at Harvard who were interested in this idea of the designated driver being diffused into the social norms of the United States. And as professionals, what we do in order to do that, we do studies on it, or then we do billboards, okay? We do public service announcements. And they decided to do something different. And by the way, designated driver has alliteration. It's catchy, easy to remember. Okay. So what they did was they got some grant funding, and they hired somebody with Hollywood connections who spent a year in Hollywood talking to producers and script writers for the top 5 television shows. And one of them, very popular at the time, was Friends. I don't know if you had that here, but all the young people watched it. And 4 other shows. And convinced them for 1 week, unannounced, but 1 week on American television, there was a designated driver written in to every script of those 5 major TV shows. Just seamlessly written in. So who's the designated driver today? Okay, that had a powerful effect on the acceptability of that in mainstream American culture. Okay, and can you see how they decided they wanted to influence the social norms outside of the traditional educational ways that we do? See, what we tend to think of as traditional education, which is people come to us and we deliver a message or a service, or we think about ad campaigns and other signages and so on. But we have been pretty oblivious to ways to think about how to influence social messaging horizontally. In other words, one of the themes of my talk is we're so darn vertical. We go to school, we get trained to be professionals, we have curricula, we do counseling, we do various sorts of services, we learn them, we deliver them as an expert to consumers, and then we hope they get something from it. And then let's be honest, the further you go away from amelioration, when people are in a lot of pain, upstream to prevention, the harder it is to get people to come in. Am I right? Let's just name it. It's just harder to get people to come in because they're not feeling the pressure point in a way. So it's much easier for me to make a living on marriage counseling, couples counseling, than it is on couples education. And we're dealing with probably human nature here, okay? That something is either got to be painful for me to go to a professional or cool. Painful or cool. I never actually said that before. I should write that down. No, that's my language. Don't write that down. Anyway, you write it down. You write it down. Okay. Painful or cool. So we're beginning to see a decline in teenage pregnancy in the United States. I don't know if is that true here yet? Is that happening here? But we're seeing a major decline. And I think programs have had something to do with it, but the norms are beginning to shift among young people. So a project I did in a high school is we recruited cool kids who were leaders, and they created a campaign they called SMART, Sexually Mature and Responsible Teens. And they put out messages about teen pregnancy that were their own language. And I still remember when they decided to do not lectures in classrooms. They decided to do, they get T-shirts with SMART on them, and one of the kids designed it. And stupid us, the adults, we didn't realize that these T-shirts would become immediately popular. We didn't have enough of them. Kids wanted to wear the T-shirts that the cool kids were wearing. And the intervention was moving among the tables in the cafeteria at lunch, going up and saying, "Are you smart?" And then they had their talking points, which they had rehearsed. And I still remember the running back, the tailback on the football team, our version of football, standing there with his shirt on, and he was a senior, calling over a couple of little sophomore boys, saying, come over here, you need to hear this." They walked up and listened to him very carefully, okay? So that's an example of a social network intervention. So somehow, and there's lots of ways it's happening, teenage pregnancy is becoming less cool. Okay, so you have the Harvard Designated Driver Project, my little one, and that high school as examples. In my own work with families, I've been part of 2 projects that I believe have had some influence on social norms in the US. And one of the ways, and I'll tell you partly how we think we can detect some influence. But I was giving talks after I wrote a book called The Intentional Family in the late 90s. If you write a book, then every school parent organization is looking for speakers, and I'm looking to sell the book, so it's a marriage made in heaven, okay? So I would go out and speak, and I was speaking about family rituals, family dinners, bedtime, and so on. And then the parents would say, well, who has time for those? Because we're running around with our kids' sports and music lessons, and we're completely booked, and so we don't have time for dinner. And so then I began to get onto something that had emerged as a family phenomenon after our kids grew up mostly in the 80s. This was not really very prominent then, but it really took off in the US in the late 80s into the 90s and got to a fever pitch. So I began to hear from parents some frustration about not having family time because their kids were involved in so many activities. Does this happen here? Okay. And of course, at the same time, parents were getting so caught up in those activities. I was reading in the local paper here of parents screaming at the ball games and carrying on this sort of hyper-involved parenting. It was at this time that I was learning to do community organizing work as part of my professional shift. My mentor in this, and I'm going to be talking about this more tomorrow, so I won't do a whole lot on it now on the model, but my mentor in this work I began to call what I was doing cultural organizing. Cultural organizing. So what happened was I gave a talk about this phenomenon, and 300 parents showed up, and it was like some sort of revival meeting. I mean, people were testifying, this is crazy, what am I doing? My kid's childhood is not like my childhood. And so, and then they asked me to come back the next year, give the same talk, and I said, no, I only give the same talk once, but if you want to organize about this, I'll come back. And so this group was a group of upper middle class suburban parents outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and they we worked for a year to create a cultural messaging around this, and we coined the term that is now commonly understood, commonly used in the United States. The term is overscheduled kids, okay? That term, and in fact, nowadays with Google is, of course, the greatest research tool in history. You can actually, there's something called Google Ngram, which is their analysis of the books, of books in English language. And the term overscheduled kids practically did not exist in English language books until this group named it, and then it took off. And so you can document that sort of change. So that group of parents coined a term, named a problem that had been seen as only a good thing. In other words, the idea was more is better, more is better, and they said no, more can be a problem, too much can be a problem. They coined a term. And then at that point, they were media ready. The New York Times sent a reporter out to Minnesota to spend 2 days interviewing families, did a full-page article on it, and then Oprah picked it up, and the NBC, the Today Show, and the parents were interviewed all over, as I was, and really helped to launch a national conversation about whether more is always better when it comes to children's activities, okay? And that conversation still goes on. It hasn't fixed the problem. But what it did was it started to create a counter norm. And what I've learned is that we want to be, we are tribal people, and we like to be part of norms, some norms. Very few of us are happy to stand out completely on our own. If you're going to a social event, most of us want to have some idea of the dress code, okay? Now, there's some people who don't care, but most of us, we want to know what the norms are. And so if you can start to create a sense that there is a group taking another norm, trying out another norm, then you can start to get some change. The other, my other personal example, and what I'm doing, I'm giving these are outside of couple relationships, but I'm trying to stimulate your imagination about how these things can happen, okay? So there's another one about parenting, and that is what's happened in the US to children's birthday parties. Ooh, see? See, when I say something like that, I listen for the ooh from the audience, okay? Which means that it's a pressure point for a number of parents. And so where that one happened was a parent educator who'd been learning to do community work and work on social norms began to listen in his classes to parents complaining about all they had to do to prepare for the child's birthday party, more than they cared to do. And one day a parent said, we should have a ban on goodie bags, party bags. I don't know what you call them here, but the pieces of junk kids go home with, okay, which gets thrown out. And it lit up the classroom. It lit up the room. Okay, there are about 12 parents, lit them up. Now, this parent educator was now oriented to community and cultural norms, and instead of saying, oh, that's nice, let's go back to our curriculum, he let the conversation go for a while. And there was a lot of angst about what had been happening with kids' birthday parties. And he called me and said, I think we have another one here. And so I said, is the parent who brought this up, is she a leader? And in community organizing, you define a leader as somebody who others listen to. Not positional leaders, not institutional leaders. He said yes. So we had coffee with her. She invited some other people. Then we formed a group of about 8 parents, and we met again every other week for a year or more to look at what limited research was available on this, to do messaging, to interview, talk one-on-one to parents, and then to come up with a name. And we coined this, we called our little organization Birthdays Without Pressure, and we coined the term out-of-control birthday parties. And then through, and now this is an important part of how you do social norm change, is through media. And I do a lot of media interviews, and journalists would call me about marriage or something, and then I'd sneak in, this other thing I'm working on is this, the out-of-control birthday parties. And some of them would go, whoa, isn't that interesting? Particularly if they were young parents. And so by that point, then USA Today, prominent national paper, was interested in having an exclusive on this. The Today Show people that I knew, our big national morning thing, which I had known from the Overscheduled Kids thing, I knew a producer there. I said, would you like the exclusive for the national TV? The University of Minnesota, where I work, they had their whole media relations department on this. And so we had a public launch event in which the parents in the group got 180 parents to show up on a Tuesday evening. And we had TV cameras, newspapers, local, national, there. And I did a presentation that was highly interactive, and so there was great camera shots of parents. And then that produced a firestorm of media interviews, including from Australia, on 4 continents, that the parents mostly did, with me doing some of them as well. Okay? By that point, the parents were all on message. So we knew, for example, not to be prescriptive, not to say how many children should be at a party, but to suggest that these norms have carried us to the point where more is better, bigger is better, and simple means you're undervaluing your child. Okay? We created a website, the university did, and the university my college had to buy more server space because there were so many visits to the website. And then my favorite interview was with a very formal BBC interviewer from London who was interviewing me about this project. And then he said, I can't do his accent very well, but he said, I probably shouldn't say this, but I certainly hope your movement comes to Great Britain. Okay, he completely broke out of his role. Well, what's happened, and I can't prove exactly what our influence on this is, but what's happening in middle-class parent culture in elite cities like San Francisco, where the trends, have you ever heard the term hyper-parenting and helicopter parenting? These trends start with upper middle-class educated parents, and then they diffuse to the rest of the population. What's happening in elite parenting culture in San Francisco, how do I know? My grandchildren are there, is a trend towards present-free birthday parties. Ooh. Okay, so it's now become cool, the thing, to not have everybody bring $20 worth of presents and have 25 kids there. So those are my own experiences with this idea that cultural norms, if there is a pressure point or an idea ready to happen, we can influence social norms. A pressure point, and so parents feeling like they were running themselves ragged with their children, parents feeling like they were exhausted at these birthday parties, with kids getting more and more entitled to more and more. So a pressure point or some sort of social idea like this designated driver that was ready to pop. Okay? What we often do is we bemoan bad social norms, whatever we consider bad social norms, and then we come across like scolds. Why are all these young people doing such and such and such and such? Okay? Whereas if we look for an idea ready to happen, somebody once defined leadership as finding a parade and getting out ahead of it. I thought that was more profound than you actually gave that credit for. But anyway, maybe you're taking it in. Maybe you're taking it in. But if there is something ready to happen and we can influence it in a positive direction based on what we know and understand, this is where science and professional knowledge and lay social movements can come together. Okay? Then we have the potential to make something happen. So what would social network influence in relationships, in marriage be? You may have heard the term a meme. M-E-M-E, which is like a virus, an idea virus. A lot of fashion is about social memes, okay? It's about what's cool. What are memes? So I can tell you an example of a meme that completely shifted in my working career. We went from cohabitation as being living in sin, shacking up and living in sin, to you're an idiot if you don't. And from a social science research perspective, there was no hard evidence on either side of that, by the way, okay? I mean, it wasn't that, we never had evidence that you were doomed in 1970 if you cohabitated. And we don't have any decent research now that says you are doomed if you don't, or you're an idiot if you don't. But that is a very powerful social norm, even among young people who are quite religious. And here's how it goes. Why would you buy a car without test driving it? And so I'm not here to argue against cohabitation. I think that's here to stay, and we need to continue to study it and so on. But what I'm really saying is the cultural meme, the cultural idea that of course you will, because you're stupid if you don't, is entirely wrong. I mean, from a social science perspective, not even getting into what anyone's moral religious perspectives is. At best, it's an option. But can you see the power of that? The power of that. And so what sorts of memes around relationships might be ready for challenge? And here's the thing I've learned is, if you're going to challenge an existing one, you can't come across like a scold. You can't come across moralistic and prescriptive. Because, and I think Australia is probably enough like the US in this regard, a fundamental assumption of societies like ours is freedom of choice. Nobody tells me what to do, right? Am I right? Libertarianism is a powerful undercurrent. And people rebel against anybody telling them they need to, you're doing something wrong, you need to change it, okay? So in our work around overscheduled kids and out-of-control birthday parties, we carefully worked at messaging. So when the media, when Katie Couric, the prominent Today Show host, said, so Bill, how many activities should a child have? And then I was prepared to say, depends on the child, depends on the family. What we really want to urge people to do is to look at their values about your family and what kind of balance you want for your child's life, okay? And not to necessarily go along with the idea that the way you show your child is important is by scheduling in more things, okay? So you consult your values and don't necessarily go along with the tide. That is a very appealing message in a individualistic libertarian culture. You follow what I'm saying? Okay? And so the challenge is to know the culture you're trying to influence. Know that, for example, people are tired of one new research study after another. Just like if you're working with a client, a couple, a family, you have to get into their culture, use language that they get, okay? Otherwise, we're not effective. Similarly, when we think about our cultures around us, we have to be cultural analysts and be careful that in purporting a new idea, we don't come across so counter to the culture that's a part of us that we just get dismissed. And so then I return then to the beginning of my talk, because there are so many competing experts out there. I mean, think about, I don't know if you see them here, but every new rat study on some nutritional thing, they're doing on our local news about, vitamin D or vitamin E. I mean, it gets to be so much expert input that people click off, okay? So if we are a part of what I call the trickle-down idea of how you bring about change, we're doomed. And that is that knowledge begins at elite research universities, and then it trickles down to professionals who are not professors, okay? And then it trickles down to community members. And there are a few things that go the way, but not many. Not many. Most of it is this sea of influence, where research has an influence. I'm happy to do research and to contribute. So don't disparage that, but it's not this sort of linear trickle down. Professionals, we have a contribution. We are often looked to. But then the most powerful influence is happening horizontally in social networks, which in turn can be influenced if we are skillful. We can have an influence on those social networks. But if we don't, if we're not skillful, then we just get dismissed. We just get dismissed by those social networks. So what I'd like you to be thinking about after the tea is this question. Based on the information I've shared, to the extent to which you buy it, what can we proactively do with social network influences? Okay, and I gave examples of some like multi-year organizational projects. So some of those could be mounted, but not necessarily by everybody locally. But one hint I'll give you to be thinking about is, what do you make of the fact that, on average, each person coming to a class, each person seen in a counseling situation, that person may, on average, influence 8,000 other people by the choices they make, the changes they make. And then I would say, and this is how I end my community presentations to parents and couples, I end it this way. I talk about the social network stuff at the end, and I talk about on average, the 8,000 people influence. And then I say, and that's with people not trying. That's just me living my life. That's just me changing my behavior, okay? Investing in my marriage, quitting smoking, making some other change. That's me just living. What if I deliberately wanted to influence my 8,000? What if I said, no, I'm an influencer, not just a consumer, okay? I'm a social change agent in my world. What if I were intentional about that? What if I had support and skills for that? And then, what if we did it? What if we organized? What if there was a group of us who wanted to make a difference? And a lot of the positive changes in healthcare have come about that way. One of the most memorable presentations I was ever invited to do was to the La Leche League, which is breastfeeding league, La Leche International. It was founded by 5 or 6 middle-class women in suburban Chicago, Illinois, in the U.S. in the 1950s who wanted to breastfeed their children. And there was a cutoff of a whole generation of mothers who had bought the idea that scientifically based formula was the way to go, and that breastfeeding was sort of primitive. And there was nobody to help them. Their mothers couldn't help them. So they organized, they found a nurse or a physician or somewhere that could help them. And they didn't stop there. They organized La Leche League International. And one of the founding mothers introduced me for my presentation, which was an incredible honor. There are, and in the US, we have something called Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, which started with a parent, a mother who had lost her teenager to a drunk driver, and started a powerful social movement. And then when we get policy, in my mind, really affects these sorts of, it becomes very influential when the culture is ready for it. When the culture is ready for it, okay? So last example, and then we'll take our break, about how policy and social change have to go together. And I've seen even in the time we visit Australia, cigarette smoking not in restaurants anymore. Some of us old enough to remember a day, at least in the US, there would be several ashtrays at each table here in a room like this, okay? We knew since 1964, the Surgeon General of the United States produced a definitive report on the evil effects of cigarette smoking on health. The science was very clear. But policy has to come along with cultural change. And when we got to secondhand smoking, do you have that term here? Okay. Yeah, passive. When we got there, that was the final cultural shift. There was data on that and cultural shift, because then we got past the libertarian argument, if you want to smoke, it's none of my business. Okay? When we got to the point of saying it is my business because what comes out of your lungs influences me and my health, then the culture has shifted enough that policymakers could pass a law banning cigarette smoking in all public places in the United States. Okay? But if the policymakers had gotten too far out ahead of this, we're big into constitutional amendments, like we have a right to bear arms, in our country. You've heard about this? So my view is that if the policymakers had gone from the research to banning public smoking, we would have in the US a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to smoke wherever you want, because the culture would have pushed back. Okay? And so what we're involved in is this organismic change over time. And so after the break, we'll have some conversation about what we can do with this.